L'kuta Sichas Chelek Chavav, Parshas Pekudei, Sicha Aleph, Lila Nishmis Rabbi Yosef ben Yamin ben Reb Nasha Kaltman. We are also learning the Schus, our dear friend, Yosef Shlema ben Risha, for a Refuah Shlema Ukreva. Very, very Gishmak Sicha, a lot of moving parts, but when you see all the parts as they come together as one, when the whole puzzle fits together so perfectly, it is really, truly a Gishmak to learn this and to understand it. And this is what we're going to do today, Parshas Pekudei, just for the sake of an introduction. We're coming from Parshas Vayakel. In Parshas Vayakel, the Torah spoke about the preparation, the collecting for the building of the Mishkan, and then the fact that the Yidden built a Mishkan. In Parshas Pekudei, we have, at least in the first part of the Parsha, we have the counting of the various different materials, specifically the gold, the silver, and the copper that was donated for the building of the Mishkan. We then have the story of, or the fact that the Yidden prepared the Bigdei Kohuna, the priestly garments, and then the Yidden bring all the kelim that they had prepared for the Mishkan. They bring it to Moshe, and Moshe sees that it was done as Hashem would have wanted, and Moshe blesses them. And this is the structure of the parsha that's going to be very relevant to some of the details being discussed in the Sikha. Let us begin. In the Pirush HaPasuk Eileh Pekudei HaMishkan Asher Pukad Al Pi Moshe Avedas HaLevim B'Yad Isamar. The first pasuk in this parsha says these are the Pekudei HaMishkan that were appointed or were entrusted by Moshe, the work of the Levim in the hands of Isamar ben Aaron. So Rana Plukte in Mefarshim, there's a machlekes in the Mefarshim that is going to address the word Pekudei. What is the translation of the word Pekudei? And based on that, is this pasuk a culmination of the previous parsha Vayakel, or is it an introduction to the upcoming parsha, Parshas Pekudei? And let's take one pirush at a time. Aleph ein pirush is as Eileh Pekudei HaMishkan bat Tzitzich after Maisa HaMishkan versteht in the Friedike Sedra. One pirush says that it's referring to the building of the Mishkan that was discussed in the previous Sedra. Where the parsha, which is Vayakel, discusses in detail the building of the Mishkan and its vessels. Is the tais from Pekudei HaMishkan Avodas HaLevim, and based on that, the translation of the word Pekudei, as it fits into the context of the pasuk, from Lashon Minui v'Tafkid, from the word Minui, appointment, or Tafkid, the task. As the Mishkan Bekelov, Zayin in the Pekudei Avedas HaLevim Shapag Damesha B'Yad Isamar, that this Mishkan and the Kelim that were discussed in Parshas Vayakel are the responsibility of the Levim, who are under the leadership of Isamar. As we learn in Parshas Chumash Bamidbar, in Parshas Nosei specifically, that the Levim were appointed to carry and to transport the Mishkan and the Kelim. So Eileh Pekudei is saying, according to this pshat, that all these things that were discussed in the previous parsha were given over to the Levim, led by Isamar, to be in charge of them, to carry them, to transport them, etc. That's one pshat. That Pekudei means appointed, and is referring to the appointment of the Levim to take charge of all the things that were created in the previous parsha. Then there's another pshat also brought in the Mefarshim, that Eileh Pekudei HaMishkan made mechesmen von dem Zav, Kesef and Cheshes von Nidas HaMishkan, was wird weiter ausgerechnet in unserer Sedre. That Pekudei HaMishkan is referring to the calculations, the reckoning of the gold, silver, and copper that was donated to the Mishkan, that is listed in this Sedre in Pekudei. Is Pekudei miloshen minyan v'cheshbon, and according to that, the taich, the translation of the word Pekudei, means the numbers or the calculations. Und der Pirush von Avedas HaLevim B'Yad Isamar is, as Isamar is granted Mamunah v'Gabay after Zav, Kesef, and Necheshes in the Milf and the Levim. And then the second part of the pasuk that says the work of the Levim in the hands of Isamar is saying that Isamar was the agent in charge, or the treasurer who was in charge of counting the gold, silver, and the copper with the help of the Levim. So there's two differences. Number one, in the first pirush, the Eileh Pekudei is the culmination of the previous parsha, and the taich of Pekudei means appointment or job or responsibility. And the second pirush is that Pekudei means numbers, And this pasuk is referring not to what happened in the previous parsha, but it's an intro into what's about to be discussed in this parsha. These are the two pirushim that we find in Mefarshim on this pasuk. In Pirush Rashi after pasuk, when it comes to Rashi, we find something surprising. Wo sein Pirush auf den ersten Teil Pasuk is the Cheida bestiert zu sein Pirush auf den zweiten Teil Pasuk, where seemingly the way Rashi translates the beginning of the Pasuk contradicts or conflicts with what Rashi translates in the end of the Pasuk. And the Rebbe explains, Eile Pekudei, when it comes to the words Eile Pekudei, Taich Rashi says, Beparsha zu nimnu kol mishkalei nidvas hamishkan. In this parsha, all of the weights of the donations of the Mishkan are listed or are counted. Das heißt, der Pshat von Pekudei HaMishkan is a cheshbon for Nidvas HaMishkan, which means that according to this Rashi, Pekudei means the numbers, the calculations. Umemele batzit sich das nicht zu Parshas Vayakhel, sondern zu dem, was kommt weiter bei Parsha zu. And therefore, this is not a culmination of last parsha. It is an intro to this parsha, which is why Rashi says the parsha zu, because Rashi is referring to what's about to be discussed in this parsha. Aber the challenge that we have is Avedas Alavim is Rashi Mefarish. When it comes to Rashis or three Rashis later, the words Avedas Alavim in the pasuk, Rashi says Pekudei HaMishkan v'Kelov Hi Aveda HaMesura Lalavim b'Midbar. The job of the Mishkan and the Kelim was entrusted to the Leviim in the Midbar, lo seisu leherid ulahakim, to carry, to dismantle, and to erect ish the masaya mufkad of each person, according to the job that was given to him, as it is told in Parshas Nosei, v'hainu. So the Rebbe concludes from this, as Pekudei HaMishkan v'Kelov may need invited again cheshbon for Nidvas HaMishkan. According to the second part of Rashi, that Pekudei means the job of the Leviim to carry the Mishkan or to transport the Mishkan. That means that the word Pekudei doesn't mean the calculation, the count, nor the minui afin Mishkan, but the appointment of the Mishkan. So the second part of Rashi seems to be going with the first pirush that we brought in the beginning of the Sikha, that Pekudei HaMishkan means the job of carrying and transporting the Mishkan, and therefore this pasuk is a culmination of the previous parsha. So the first and very obvious question is, how do you reconcile this conflict in these two Rashis, where the first Rashi teaches Pekudei to mean numbers, the second Rashi teaches Pekudei to mean responsibility or appointment or job? And because of that, the first pshat seems that this pasuk is an intro to this parsha, where the second Rashi seems that this pasuk is a culmination, is a conclusion of the previous parsha. The Rebbe is now going to introduce that if you haven't opened the Chumash to look at the Rashis yet, so the Rebbe tells you that in the first Rashi, he only quoted part of the first Rashi, which means there's two separate Rashis that Rashi quoted, but he only quoted to us the first part of the first Rashi. Because that first Rashi ends, that in this parsha, they count all the weights of the donations for the Mishkan, which that we already know. Rashi quoted that part, but then the Rashi continues, the nimnu kol kelim l'chalav, and they also count all of the kelim for the avodas, for the various different services that they were needed for. Das heißt, which means, as mit Pekudei HaMishkan wird gemeint nicht nur der cheshbon von Nidvas HaMishkan, that when we say Pekudei, that it means numbers. It doesn't just mean the calculation of the donations of the Mishkan, which are said immediately after this, shortly after this pasuk. But also there was another count. They counted the kelim. Obviously, not like the how many kelim there were, as we'll see later in the Sikha, but they went through all the kelim that they had. Which are listed later on in this Sedra, after the story about the making of the big Dikuna, where it says that they brought the Mishkan to Moshe, they brought all the Kalim for Moshe to look at, to give his approval. So we see from Rashi that there's two different counts in this parsha. One of the money, two of the Kalim. is verstandig der Kisher Ra'inyan from Pekudei HaMishkan. And according to this, we'll now understand, and now this will explain the connection between Pekudei HaMishkan and what Rashi says, Avedas HaLevim, that the Levim were going to carry and transport the Mishkan. Because the second count of the Mishkan, meaning to say the minyan hakelim l'chol avedasei, is verbunden mit Avedas HaLevim l'aseh ul'hered l'hakim. The second part of the first Rashi, where it discusses the fact that the Kelim were counted, that is related to the job of the Levium to transport these Kelim. In Parshas Nosei, as it says in Parshas Nosei, V'shemeis tifkedu, as claim ishmeres masam, with names, you should appoint those who would be in charge of the various different Kelim. As the meaning of Masa Mishkan is Kelod and Tafkid to halten a chesben von alle Klei Mishkan, it's understood very obviously that if you are in charge of transporting the Mishkan, then you have to keep count of all the Kelim, and to make sure that they remain whole and not damaged in transport, in transit, etc. So the Rashis don't really form a conflict anymore if you follow this explanation. Pekudei means the count, but it includes two different counts: the count of the money that came in, gold, silver, copper, and the account of the Kelim. And those Kelim, who was in charge of them? The Levium. They had to transport them, and therefore they had to make sure that they had all of them and that they were all not damaged. So according to this, you could explain that the Rashis are not arguing. Eila Pekudei means the count, and it is an introduction to this parsha, not a conclusion of the previous parsha. But the fact that it brings in the Levium is because the Kelim that were counted in this parsha were given the job, the responsibility was given to the Levium. But the Rebbe has a question. What remains not understood is as follows. What compels Rashi to say that there were two different counts? That it's not just referring to the count of the donations, but it's also referring to the count of the Kelim. And because of that, you have to say that Avedas HaLevim refers to their responsibility over the Klei HaMishkan, to carry, to dismantle, to erect, etc. Why do you have to say that? On the contrary, it's a difficult pirush. But if the Torah is mafsik zwischen die zwei Minyanim mit dem Sipur von Asiyas Big Dikuna, because the Torah interrupts between the two counts, between the count of the donations and the count of the Kelim, there's the story of the Big Dikuna in the middle. It's schwer zu sagen, dass Eile Pekudei HaMishkan matzit sich euch zu an Inyan in der Parsha shel acharei acharel. It's difficult to say that Eile Pekudei is referring to something that is after the parsha, that we're just about to learn. In other words, if you're going to say these are the counts, so say there was this count and that count. But to say there was this count, and then to say something else entirely, and then go back to another count, it doesn't seem that the flow is connected. So the Rebbe concludes the question, especially since it's dachuk, why would you say that there was two different counts? And because of that, Avedas HaLevim means that the count of the Kelim was the responsibility of the Leviim. Since at this point, at this juncture, we're understanding that Rashi says that Pekudei means to count. As Avedas HaLevim b'yadi samar meant, as the minyan from Nidves HaMishkan, hat Moshe übergegeben zu the Levim b'yadi samar. He should have said there was one count, the count of the Nidves HaMishkan, which comes right after this pasuk, and the fact that it says Avedas HaLevim is because this count was under the responsibility of Yisamar, who led the Levim. So why do you have to say that it's referring to the transportation or the transportation of the Mishkan? Because there was a second count of Kol Kelev. Say there was one count, the count of Nidvus HaMishkan. When the pasuk says Avedas HaLevim, it's referring to the fact that they were responsible for this count, the count of the Nidavis. What compels Rashi to say that there are two separate counts? In Siv Gimel, the Rebbe is going to ask two additional questions. Besides for this question that we have on the end of Rashi, why he says that there was a second count, we also have to understand the beginning of Rashi, where he says, and this parsha is counted all the weights of the donations for the Mishkan, for the silver, the gold, and the copper. The Teichen from the Pekudei steht in the Rashbam. This same theme is in the Rashbam. Aber dort steht es bekitzer. Over there it's written much more concisely. Eile Pekudei. What's tied Pekudei? Cheshbein, hakesef, vazav, vanocheshes. The account, or the accounting, the reckoning of the gold, the silver, the gold, and the copper. So it's very good. You know what the word Pekudei means? It means the cheshbon. However, Rashi is much more elaborate. Aleph, first of all, Rashi uses the words beparsha zu nimnu, that it's counted in this parsha. When Rashi sagt minyan mishkele nidvas hamishkan, had Rashi just said the count of the weight of the donations of the Mishkan, for a statement showing us Eilep Pekudei tzitzich nit zu parsha vayakel v'usus nitakin chesed for nidvas hamishkan not zu parsha zu. We would already know just by telling us that it's about the count. We would know that this pasuk belongs to Pekudei and not to vayakel, because in vayakel there's no count. So the adgasha of parsha zu. Why does Rashi have to emphasize that it's in this parsha? Mefarshim Zadim Avayr. Mefarshim address this and they explain. As Baal says, since there are two psukim between the pasuk Eila Pekudei and when the count actually begins, in those psukim it mentions Betzalel and the Aliyah who were entrusted to lead the building of the Mishkan. The Rebbe was Rashi Bavarin and Afal Pekain passed the Lashon Eila Pekudei HaMishkan, but the Cheshbon said the parsha zu. And therefore, Rashi, it makes sense for Rashi to say the parsha zu, because Rashi has to clarify to us that's going to be in this parsha. Because you see Eila Pekudei, you read the next pasuk, you see Betzalel. So you're going to wonder, where is this Pekudei? So Rashi says beparsha zu, it's later in the parsha. So the Mefarshim explain that's what Rashi says beparsha zu. But the Rebbe says this is not a sufficient explanation why it says beparsha zu, because Rashi had gedav zagen, if Rashi was just coming to clarify that the count is in this parsha a little bit later, then what Rashi should have said is minyan mishkan nidus mishkan ha'amur beparsha. He should have first said what Pekudei means, that it means the count, and only then to say it's in the parsha. Does his frier uptight Eila Pekudei minyan mishkeli? First to explain what's the tights of Pekudei, that it means the count. Und then noch zugeben, wo das wird gesagt, the parsha zu. And then to add where it's said that it's somewhere in this parsha. Al derech pirish Rashi neish parsha Telis, as we see Rashi did in the first Rashi of Telis, where it says ve'ele Telis Yitzchak. These are the children of Yitzchak. Says Rashi Yaakov ve'Esav ha'amur beparsha. That it's referring to Yaakov and Esav that are mentioned in the parsha, because there's a whole story of Rivka becoming pregnant, and until Yaakov and Esav are born, it takes a few psukim. So Rashi is amur beparsha. They will be mentioned later in the parsha. Why did Rashi begin his pirush with the fact that it's in this parsha, implying that the fact that it's in this parsha is an emphasis unto itself? What is the emphasis of the fact that it's in this parsha? That's our first question on the first part of Rashi here in Siv Gimel. Beis, another question. Nimnu kol mishkele nidvas hamishkan. Rashi says they counted all of the weights of the donations of the Mishkan. L'may nafkamina adgasha zu. Why couldn't he just say they counted all the donations? Why say all the weights of the donations? Nachmer. And the question is even more gishmak. On this pasuk we find a different translation when it comes to Targum Onkelos versus Targum Yonasan. In Onkelos state Elaine Minyone Mashkina. Onkelos says these are the numbers of the Mishkan. Aber in Targum Yonasan sagt Elaine Minyoni Miskilein Uschumhein de Mashkina. These are the numbers of the weights, Miskele Miloshin Mishkal, Uschumhain, and the numbers and the amounts, Schumhain from the word Schum, of the Mishkan. Zetman as Onkelos was an answer to Rashi. So we see from this that Onkelos, which is usually closer to Pshat, which is closer to Rashi, Zok Nardim Lashon Minyan, only uses the word Minyan, the number. When Rashi claims this, well, Rashi does not follow Targum Onkelos to suffice with the word minyan, but he seems to go in the direction of Targum Yonasan. Unis meisif mishkali, and he adds the word mishkali, the weights. But on the other hand, is there mashmitam for uschumen? He omits the word uschumen. Rashi doesn't bring that they also counted the amounts. They counted the weights, says Rashi. So the question is, A, why does Rashi B'chlal say they counted the weights? And if he's saying they counted the weights, why doesn't he say they counted the amounts, as Targum Yonasan ben Uziel says? So these are our questions so far. Our main question is, on the second part of Rashi, why does Rashi say that there were 2 counts? What compels Rashi that there were 2 counts? And then say that Avedis HaLevi means that there were Kalim that the Levim were in charge of. Why doesn't he say there was 1 count and the Levim were in charge of that count? Then why does Rashi say the words B'Parsha Zu in this parsha? What's the emphasis of that? And then why does Rashi add Kol Mishkali, all of the weights of the Nidvas HaMishkan? And Sivdal, the Rebbe is going to begin the beer by first explaining to us what is really bothering Rashi. Once we understand what's bothering Rashi, we'll be able to understand what Rashi is telling us, or what he's answering, and why Rashi says what he says, and why Rashi says that there was 2 counts, not 1 count. When Rashi is coming initially to address a very simple question. When you have the word Eila, not Ve'ela, represents the fact that a new topic is beginning. Even more than that, as Rashi brings in the beginning of Mishpatim, Kol Mokim, wherever Shenemar Eila, where it says Eila, not Ve'ela, Pasala, so Yishayim, it is excluding what came before it. Not only is it a new inyan, it's a new inyan that's not connected to the previous inyan. Is it verstandig? So Rashi has a question on this. I feel of him as Elib Kodei Mishkan Batzitzich Nitz, so that Friedrich is Seder. Not to the Chesben and the Davis was state fighting in the Seder, even if you will follow the Mefarshim that say that Elib Kodei is talking about what's going to happen in this coming Seder, the counting of the donations, and not what happened in the previous Seder like the other Mefarshim. Is es doch Farta Hemshich und Uisfir. Hepich von Pasal von der Friedrich Seder. It's still a conclusion and a follow-up to the previous Seder. As nachdem wie es wird erzählt, wie Eden und Benadig und Nachas HaMishkan, that after we learned in Vayakel that Eden donated to the building, to the work of the Mishkan, and then we used their donations to make the Mishkan. Moshe Rabbeinu abgegeben zu the Eden. So after that, Moshe gives the Yidden an accounting of how much the donations added up to, and what they were used for. So there is clearly a connection between Pekudei and Vayakel. So why does the pasuk say the word Eila and not Ve'ela, which would imply that there's a connection between this pasuk and the previous parsha? That is what's bothering Rashi. Why Eila and not Ve'ela? Which means this entire Sikha and these entire Rashis is all about one Vav. Had it said Ve'ela, Rashi would have no issues. It says the word Eila, not Ve'ela. Rashi couldn't figure it out. Why are you saying that we're starting something new here? We're smack in the middle of something. Undi Shaila, this next paragraph is very cryptic because it's going to be a reference to a number of topics we're going to discuss on the next Seifim. And this is like in a nutshell what a big part of the Hemshech HaSicha is about. Di Shaila, this question of Ve'ela versus Ve'ela, Bavaran Rashi Dr. Esafa as Pekudei HaMishkan Batzitzich nit not to dem Chesben von the Nidovos nor Eich zu Minyan Kalkele v'chal Avedase. When Rashi brings the second count, that also the Kalim were counted, that answers the question why it says Eila and not Ve'ela. Because that will tell us that this parsha, and again we'll understand then why Rashi uses the word the parsha Zu, that it's actually beginning a new topic, and that's why the pasuk says Eila. So once we understand why Rashi says that they counted the Kalim, we'll understand that this is a new inyan, and we'll understand why it says Eila, not the Eila. So in order to do that, Kedila Kaman, and the Rebbe will now explain this. And in order to do this, I just want to point out, and it might be obvious to some, but that the word Nimnu, which was in Rashi, just like the word Pekudei could mean numbers, and could mean an appointment, a responsibility. Also, the word Nimnu could mean Miloshin Minyan, as in counting, or Miloshin Minui, as in an appointment, as giving a responsibility. So that's why it could be a little bit confusing what Rashi is saying. And this is what the Rebbe is going to explain over here. As with sein Pirush beParsha Zu Nimnu Kol Mishkali, that when Rashi says in this parsha Nimnu, all of the weights, meint Rashi zu teichen the word Pekudei, nit als Loshen Minui, nor als Loshen Minui v'chesed, seems to imply that Rashi is translating that the word Pekudei means counted. In this parsha, all of the weights are counted, so that means Rashi seemingly saying Pekudei means counted. Is a sabbat Rashi alein shelo. But Rashi negates that very understanding. Pekudei does not mean counting in this pasuk. Al yedei hemshech pirusha v'nimnu kol kelov. By saying that also the kelim were counted, with saying those words, Rashi tells us that Pekudei does not mean counting. Pekudei means appointment. How? As follows. As they say in Yiddish, halt cup. Then Pekudei is lashon minyan. When Pekudei does come from is in the family of counting. When you do say that Pekudei means to count, is ein badait nit zeilungen pu'ulas haminyan nor disachakel diketzolum. When you say Pekudei means to count, it doesn't mean the actual act of counting. It means the numbers, the sum totals of what was counted. These are the totals of the Mishkan, if that's what it meant. When you says the word Pekudei, if it means to count or counting, it's not about the act of counting, it's about the totals that we reach from the counting. In other words, when you say Pekudei, it would mean the designated amount or the fixed amount of the count. And the Rebbe brings a raya. This is Muchach and in Parshas Tisa. Kisisas Reish Yisrael Bnei Yisrael Lifkudeim. You will count the heads of the Jewish people. Lifkudeim. This is from the same shoirish as the word Pekudei. For Rashi Taish and Rashi says Kishatachbeit lekabel. When you will want to receive schum minyanom, the amount of their count. Ladas kamaim, to know how many there are. So we see clearly that the word Pekudei doesn't mean to go count them. It means the total amount of the count. Now that we understand that the word Pekudei means the total, the amount, not the counting. Und der badait from Pekudei passt nit auf minyan kol kelev v'chol dosei. Now this type of Pekudei doesn't work when it comes to the kelim. Says by the kelim or the Torah nit angegeben dem schum u'misper kelim, because by the counting of the kelim, the Torah doesn't give us an amount. The Torah doesn't give us a number. The pasuk is blois meine minyan zählt un bashraib to the kelim. The Torah lists them. The Torah itemizes them and describes them, but it doesn't give us a number. So when Rashi says moinin, the kelim or nimnu called kelov, it can't mean that they counted them, because you don't find they were anywhere where they were counted. What you find is that they were listed or itemized. So therefore, when Rashi uses the word nimnu on the word Pekudei, it can't mean to count, because he says nimnu also about the kelim, and the kelim weren't counted; they were listed. And since Rashi says that Pekudei goes on both counts, sai minyan nidvis hamishkan und sai minyan hakelim, both on the Mishkan and on the kelim, machte der mit klar. With this Rashi makes it very clear. Erstens says Pekudei verdoge taitz melashon mini v'tafkid. Number one, Pekudei means an appointment, a responsibility. It can't mean to count, because they never counted the kelim. They listed them, they itemized them, and they didn't count them. There was no number. So when it says Pekudei on the kelim, it can't mean counting. It has to mean the appointment, the job, the responsibility. There's another point. Now, since Rashi is comparing both counts, so just like by the count of the kelim, it wasn't a count where they counted numbers, but they just went through what they had. Also, when it comes to the counting of the money, it wasn't either about the sum total of the donations, and how it was used. Why would they do that? To address the fact that Moshe should not be accused, or they shouldn't be suspicious of Moshe's mishandling of the funds. Even by the money, by the kesef zav and the cheshes, he is counting, meaning to say he's going through what came in. He's counting, meaning to say he's listing the weights of what came in. There's no need for a sum total of how much came in. It's not what we need here, and we'll soon get to why in just a moment. But The Rebbe is telling us a very important nekuda here, and that is that since Rashi compares both counts, and just like by the Kalim, it wasn't about the numbers, it was about what came in, or what was done rather in the case of the Kalim. Also by the counts of the Nedavis, it wasn't about the numbers, it was about the weights. The weights is really more of a description of what came in. It's not about the value of how much money it was worth, or what was the amount of it. Before the Rebbe explains to us what would be the purpose of counting without numbers, without telling us the numbers, that is, the Rebbe in the brackets now uses this opportunity to answer his question Beis in Sif Gimel, why Rashi says Kol Mishkele, the weights. Why couldn't he just say Nimnu Kol Nidus HaMishkan? But now we understand. Mihai time is Rashi medayik bilshen nimnu kol mishkan nidus hamishkan. Unitalosh schum v'kademe makes sense why Rashi specifies the weights were counted, not the amount was not the amounts. Der mitvel Rashi noch mehr klar machen. Rashi wants to make it additionally clear. As dort sich nicht wegen geben as chakel von schum und and schum hoin. It is not about giving a sum total of what came in, as the Targum Yonasim and Uziel said the word schum hoin, which means amounts. No, the Torah is only mentioning the weights from the Nedavis, Lakasav, Lazav, and Acheshes. The Torah is describing what came in, but not necessarily providing us with the totals or the values of what came in. And the Tzvek von der Minyan is, what would be the purpose of such a count? If the purpose would be to for Moshe's, there's a suspicion upon Moshe, then you have to tell me the total of what came in, what was done with it. So if we're not giving us the totals, then it's not because of the suspicion on Moshe. Then what is it for? Says the Rebbe, the count, the purpose of the count of the nedavos, of the donations, is the same purpose as the count of the kelim. Both counts are connected with the word Pekudei, which means the role, the job of the person in charge. And both of them, because there was someone in charge, there had to be a count. What pshat? Just like the counting of the kelim was so that it meant that the Yidden were bringing all the kelim to Moshe. So Moshe should see and establish that it was done right. Like the pasuk concludes, the Moshe saw all the work that was done, and they did it as Hashem wanted. And therefore he lists all of the kelim individually. This is, they say, that when the as alle kelim pratim zane wie viel medarf musam, when the normal process is that the person in charge has to confirm. Pashtetikin means to confirm that all of the kelim and all of the parts are there, as many as are needed, and they're all complete. So by the kelim, what was the point of the count? That the person in charge should make sure that they have everything they need. Al derech zeh is der teichen von Eisrachen and the Mishkan and Nidus HaMishkan. This was the same reason why they count the donations as Moshe zayin der memunu and balabais from Mishkan, because Moshe was in charge and Moshe is the balabas of the Mishkan. So we have to tell you that Moshe had gehalten chesben for the Mishkan and Nidus HaMishkan. That Moshe is keeping track. We want to know Moshe. We want to tell the Yidden, someone is in charge of this Mishkan, and it's Moshe Rabbeinu. He's the balabas of the Mishkan, and he's keeping track of everything that's coming in, and he's taking care of everything. The kelim, to make sure that it's all done right, and that they're all there, and they're all complete, as well as the money, that all the money that was needed came in. So this is a whole new approach to understanding what's going on over here. Pekudei means a job, a task, an appointment. And Eila Pekudei, Rashi is telling us that there was a count. But what was the purpose of the count? The purpose of the count was Pekudei, was to confirm the balabatishkeit of Moshe Rabbeinu, that Moshe was in charge of the Mishkan, and therefore he goes through the kelim, and he goes through the Nedavis HaMishkan as well. So meaning to say that when Rashi says the word v'nimnu kol kelov, by telling us the kelim, Rashi gave us a lot of information. He gave us the information that, number one, that Pekudei means appointment. Number two, that the count is not about numbers, but it's about knowing what came in. More of a description than a sum total. And that both counts are connected to each other, that they're being done as part of Moshe's job as the Memuna, as the person in charge, as the Balabayis, the owner of the Mishkan. Now we're going to go back to Ve'ela, which will also answer the words Beparsha Zu, which we asked earlier. Why did Rashi emphasize Beparsha Zu? Sivav, und das ist der Chiddush Beparsha Zu, legabe Parshas Vayakal. Now this is why there's a Chiddush. Why did it say Eila, not Ve'ela? Eila implying that there's a new thing, because the discussion here is something new. Why is it new? The discussion is about the preparation to the building and the building of the Mishkan. First, the donations that were given to the Mishkan, and then how Betzalel and Aliyav and the people with them, the Chachmei Lev, etc., how they built the Mishkan and the Kelim. Aber in unserer Parsha redet sich wegen Pekudei Mishkan. Our Parsha is discussing Pekudei, which means wegen die Minuyim und Tafkidim von die, welches an dem Munah of Mishkan, the various different responsibilities and tasks of those that were in charge of the Mishkan. And that is something brand new. That way you could say Eila. We're not talking about the building of the Mishkan or the donations of the Mishkan. We're talking about who's in charge and what the people in charge have to do. And therefore you could say Eila. It's a brand new thing. And where do you see in this parsha that there is an appointment over the Mishkan? Sagt Rashi, parsha zu nimnu kol mishkele nidvas hamishkan v'chulu v'nimnu kol kelev l'chol avidasei. That in this parsha they counted all of the weights of the donations of the Mishkan. They counted the kelim, but that's the tafka for Namamunah. This is the job of the person in charge to keep track of all of the details. So therefore, you see that we're starting to discuss a new thing: the Pekudei, the jobs of the Mishkan. What about the Rashi of Avedas Halavim, which we haven't gone back to? But now there's a Rashi of Avedas Halavim where Rashi says that the job of the kelim was entrusted to the Levium to carry it, to dismantle it, to erect it, etc. So what's Rashi saying over there? In other words, if Pekudei Taka means the appointments, and the person in charge is Moshe Rabbeinu, then what's Taitz Avedas Halavim? And what is Rashi saying in that Rashi? So this is what the Rebbe answers in this next paragraph. And to make even clearer, even more geschmack, what is the chiddush of this parsha as the retzich wegen die minuyim of Mishkan that we're discussing, the appointments, the responsibilities of the Mishkan. Is there pasuk mamshech? The pasuk continues. Asher pukad al pi v'goymer avodas haLevim b'yadi samar that was appointed by Moshe, the job of the Levium. And Rashi is the Rav Mefarish, and what does Rashi say on those words? Pekudei Mishkan v'chelav yaveda mesura leLevim v'midbar lasis, that the job of the Mishkan and the Kelim was entrusted to the Levium in the Midbar to carry. Rashi is the Mitmefaras. With these words, Rashi is explaining the rest of the pasuk as Adar Inyan from Pekudei Mishkan. That this idea that we're discussing Pekudei, the jobs of the people that were responsible for the Mishkan, was during the building of the Mishkan. Who was the person in charge? Who was the Memunah? And who had to make sure everything was there? Was Moshe Rabbeinu. Is the Achrei Akamas Mishkan, but later. And again, by saying the Achrei, not connected to before. It's not like these things that we spoke about before in Parshas Vayakel, the Leviim are in charge of. No. We're talking about that now Moshe is in charge. And because we're talking about the people being in charge, we started a new Parsha. But then, after the Mishkan is finished being built, is the Aveda Ibegegeben given to the Leviim. Moshe then delegated this Aveda to the Leviim. Super in Parshas Nasi, Baruch as Parshas Nasi talks about at length. The Leviim and Mishkan. Then later the Leviim became responsible for some of these matters of the Mishkan. So it's in the topic of responsibilities, of jobs, appointments. But we see that it's not just the appointment of Moshe, but there's various different minuyim that are being discussed in this parsha. And this emphasizes that this is a new inyan. As we start the parsha of Eila Pekudei, we're now discussing the minuyim, the various different appointments and jobs that were given in the Mishkan. Side to Moshe Rabbeinu, who was responsible at the time to count and to make sure that everything was intact and everything was there as it should be. And then again, later on, the responsibilities that are given to the Leviim to carry and to transport the Mishkan, etc. And this B'etzim answers all of our questions. Why does Rashi say there were two counts? Because in order to understand why Rashi says Eila, why the pasuk says Eila and not Ve'eila, you need to understand that it's a new Indian. It's only after you say Kol Nimnu kol kelov, the second count, which can't mean numbers, and therefore it has to mean responsibilities. Do you now know that Pekudei means responsibilities, and therefore you understand why it says Eila, it's something new, it's about responsibilities. It also explains why it says B'Parsha Zu, because Rashi wants to say that something new is beginning in this parsha, different than the previous parsha, which is why it says Eila, not Ve'ela, and why it says Kol Mishkalei, because it wants to tell us that it's not about the numbers, it's about describing what came in by weight, because we're not here to protect Moshe's transparency, Moshe's honesty. We're trying to emphasize that Moshe is the person responsible, and he is taking count of everything that's coming in. In Siv Zayin, the Rebbe is going to bring another 4 questions that other Mefarshim bring on this pasuk, and the Rebbe is going to say that this idea that this pasuk is that Parshas Pekudei is beginning with minuyim v'tafkidim, the job appointments, is going to answer all those questions at once. This explanation answers a number of other questions of this parsha. With regards to the accounting of the donations of our Sedra, there's discussion in many of the Mefarshim. Aleph number 1. The Torah tells us what was done with the gold, with the silver, and what was done with the copper, but not what was done with the gold. It does tell us how much gold came in, but it does not tell us what was done with the gold. Now again, if we're following the opinion with before the Rebbe's answer, that this is about Moshe's transparency, then why wouldn't it tell us what was done with the gold? Maybe the gold was pocketed, chas v'shalom. Base, I feel when it gets to kesef, even with regards to the silver, is there chesben given out from kesef pekudei eida. The account that's given is from the money that was used to count the people. Everyone gave a half shekel, which was used for the adonim, for the silver sockets. But people were also able to give give voluntarily whatever they wanted, and they gave silver as well, in addition to the machzah shekel. That is not mentioned in the count. As Rashi says earlier on in the Chumash, as from them that from the silver that came in the general donations, not in the machzah shekel, they made various different service vessels in the Mishkan. So why does the pasuk not tell us the count of the silver that came in besides for the machzah shekel? Gimel. Chutz die Nedavis von Zav, Kesef und Necheshes. Seine gewähren noch 10 Minim, welche hat Menade gewähren und Trumas HaMishkan. In addition for the gold, silver, and copper, there were 10 other types of materials that were donated. Cheles, Argamon, different shemen, different things that were donated. As the pasuk tells us, Parshas Truma. We don't find Moshe to give an accounting of any of those things. How much wool came in, how much how much oil came in, etc., etc. Dalit, 4th point. In pasuk steht, dass man gebracht und Davis Mishkan bis es gewen Häuser. The pasuk tells us that they brought so much to the Mishkan that it was too much. Man hat gebracht mehr, wie viel man gedarf. They brought more than needed. And we don't find anywhere an accounting of that extra money, which seemingly is a very important account when it comes to transparency. If they needed X amount of dollars, X amount of money, and they had an extra amount, that's the first amount, God forbid, that could get misplaced. But we don't find any chesben of any of it. So in other words, number 1, why does the Torah not tell us what was done with the gold? And number 2, why does the Torah not count for us the rest of the silver, the other things that were donated to the Mishkan, and all the leftover stuff that came in that wasn't needed? Now, before we get to the answer, the Rebbe's answer, just to understand how geschmack the Rebbe's answer is, the Rebbe is going to bring a different answer and then tell us why it's not a good enough answer. With regards to the last 3 things, which means the extra silver, the other items that were donated to the Mishkan, and the hoiser, the extra stuff that wasn't needed. So there is a mefarish that learns like this. As Moshe is only giving an accounting of those things that are of great importance. But not from the less expensive, less important materials. It's textile. It's not as valuable as gold and silver. And then the extra silver that came in was not a huge sum, and therefore it was insignificant. And also the extra money, it wasn't a significant amount, so Moshe doesn't have to say anything. That's what some of Farshim learn. That the gold, silver, and copper, that was a very expensive and a very important part of the donation. Therefore, Moshe focuses on that. Everything else is not significant. Or doesn't it consider it's maspik? But it's not a sufficient answer. If the whole reason why they're counting the weights is because a Gabbai has to give a detailed account from the money of tzedakah that he raised, so that there shouldn't be any suspicion on him that he's mishandling the funds. That should be applicable whether the sum is a huge sum or not such a great sum. The pasuk says you should be clean, which means you should always make sure that nobody could the deeper pshat is that nobody suspects you. You have to give a full, detailed accounting, at least to the very last shekel. And since that's the case, that if this was about the trustworthiness of Moshe, then there shouldn't be anything that's not significant to the count. Why does Rashi not answer these questions? These shaylas are in traditional mikra, these are very basic questions. We see how many of the Mefarshim are trying each one in their own way to answer this question, and Rashi says nothing. But according to what we learned previously in this sikha, that Pekudei is about the minui, about the appointment of Moshe, who's in charge of the Mishkan, and not about the number specifically, is kushya meikara lesa. These questions don't even begin. Why? When the give us the count of all of these nedavis in the Mishkan, it's not to tell us that Moshe gave us a detailed cheshbon of every last dollar. Nor ad dazainen minyanim was Moshe als memunah of Mishkan durchgeführt, bichdei zu halten cheshbon in nedavis. What the Torah is telling us is that these are counts, these are reckonings that Moshe, as the agent in charge of the Mishkan, carried out in order to keep track of everything in the Mishkan. Unav zu lassen wissen dem Inyan is genug a Beispiel der Minyan von der Ikin Davis the Kastav Zav on the Cheshes. We just need an example. We just need to see a sample of Moshe's books to know that Moshe is doing his job. In other words, there's no chashad on Moshe that he's going to mishandle the funds. That's not a problem, because if that was the case, then we would need to have a detailed cheshbon of every last dollar and what everything went to, and we don't see that. The point is that everyone should recognize that Moshe is in charge, and that Moshe does the things that an agent in charge does. One of those things is inventory and making sure that all the accounts are as they should be. So as long as we see a sample of what Moshe is doing, we know he's doing his job. We know that he's the Mamunah. We don't even need to know if he's doing his job. We know that he's the Mamunah. He's counting. So with regards to the other three things, the rest of the silver, the other minim, the other items that were donated to the Mishkan, and the Hoiser, the fact that the Torah doesn't say anything is because we don't need to know the numbers. As we said before, it's not about Schumain, it's about Mishkalei. And what's the Mishkalei? Just to know that someone is in charge, that Moshe is in charge. So once we see that some of the stuff is being done, the Zov, the Kesef, the Nechoshes, it's being counted, we're good. And why doesn't it tell us about the Zov? Why does the Torah Zov is already part of the sample? So why doesn't it tell us what was done with the Zov? The Rebbe brings earlier in the Hara that the Kliyakar says that this is before the big day kahuna, and the gold went into the begadim of the kahuna, and therefore they didn't exactly know what it was done with. And the Rebbe says if that's the case, then later he should have given us an account of the Zav, of the gold. After he tells us if we need to know it, we need to know it to tell us when we're ready. But the Rebbe over here says something else. When the Pfarrer is kein Kashenit. It's not a question why he doesn't give us a detailed report of what was done with the gold. Because the purpose here was not to tell us what was done with it, to remove the suspicion of himself. And even thus, was the Torah is mefaret of them was mit genus in the davis kommt not b'derech hagav. The fact that the Torah does tell us, for example, about the silver, what it was done was, it was only a side point. That isn't the main point here. That we should know what was done with it. But rather, as Rashi is very precise, nimnu kol mishkal in idvis hamishkan, as the minyan hamishkalim state the parsha zu ele pekudei, weil in dem state the tafkid hamemuna. All the Torah wants to tell us is that Moshe is in charge, and Moshe was taking care of making sure that everything is being counted. To know what was done with it, Torah tells us a little bit. To know what was counted, Torah tells us some of the stuff. But exactly every last dollar, or even to know what was done with everything, that is not necessary. Therefore, there's no necessity to tell us what was done with everything. And because of that, we specifically avoid going into it, especially by the gold, that there was so many details. The begodim had gold in them, and the pareches had gold in it, and there was so many things that had some gold in it, that if the Torah would list it, it would be a very, very long list. So if it would be necessary, if it was about chshad, about suspicion on Moshe, he had to know, the Torah would tell it us. But it's not about chshad. It's about confirming the fact that Moshe is the balabas of the Mishkan. And therefore, it's not necessary. And because it's not necessary, the Torah specifically avoids going into all the details. Even not as a side thing. Because with the other Nedavis, let's say, for example, the Adonim. They out of all the silver, machzah shekel, they did the Adonim. It's a quick thing, so the Torah could say, I'll tell you what they did with it. But when it comes to the gold, there's no reason for it, and there's no reason for it, and there's a lot of details. The Torah specifically avoids it, and it's not even a question, because it wasn't about Moshe's trustworthiness, it was about proclaiming the fact that Moshe is the Memunah and the Balabas of the Mishkan. Here's the initial Torah. And here's another takeaway from the fact that Rashi uses the word Mishkan